Cherry MX versus Gateron versus Kailh versus Razer versus Outemu. Now let's compare. What are the differences between these mechanical keyboards? Basically, Cherry MX switches are the OGs and the others are just copycats, but when Cherry lost its patent, other companies swarmed in and made their own versions of the switch. These companies include Gateron, Kailh, Outemu, and Razer. Most of these switches are under par compared to Cherry's with the exception of Gateron. Gateron is Cherry's biggest competitor. We'll look at this more in a bit more detail in this video, and we'll go over the things on what to look for when deciding on a key switch, and it all goes down to personal preference. So let's start. Cherry MX switches. When most people think of switches, their initial thought is usually the Cherry MX switches because it's the first manufactured, patent, and produced keyboard switches. They even came up with the idea of naming the switches with a specific color depending on their actuation force, spring weight, and the type of switch. For example, their popular linear switch is called the Cherry MX Red, while the popular clicky switch is called the Cherry MX Blue. And for a long time, the Cherry MX switches were regarded as the best of the best, and no one came close to comparison. However, when Cherry lost its patent, it has then started losing its dominance over the industry. Now, Cherry switches still have an amazing quality, and they're still the best, even though it's not as obvious as it used to be. Although they no longer have the patent, Cherry MX switches and competitors are free to come in and challenge Cherry MX switches to create a very similar switch, often at a reduced cost. However, many companies also copy their original idea of naming their switches by the color based on the same principles. And this way, the consumer knows exactly what's being sold to them, and it's pretty much making the job easier for Cherry's competitors because they don't have to explain what those switches are because Cherry did it for them. However, it's still one of the most durable switches. With other brands, you're looking at about 50 to 80 million keystrokes worth of lifespan, but Cherry has about 100 million keystrokes, and because of this quality, you'll be paying for it. Most Cherry switches range for about $0.5 to $1. So if money is not an issue for you, honestly, you can't go wrong with Cherry MX switches. However, if you're trying to stay on a budget, there are plenty of other high-quality switches for a cheaper price. Now for the Gateron switches. Gateron is Cherry's biggest competitor, and some may argue that their switches are even better. While they may not be as durable since their keystrokes doesn't last up to 100 million, where they shine is with their unique feel, especially with the linear switches such as their reds or yellows. Some actually prefer Gateron compared to Cherry linear switches because they're more smooth and the feeling is overall a better experience. However, some people agree that Gateron falls short when it comes to their tactile switches because gamers are the ones that typically lean towards Gateron switches because linear switches are the most recommended style for gaming. However, when it comes to spring force and travel distance, Cherry and Gateron are similar. They both have a travel distance of 4 millimeters and they have a similar spring force, which is dependent on the switch type. However, if you've never heard of Gateron or never really done research about them, I encourage you to do so. They're an amazing switch, especially if you're in the market for a linear switch. Now for the Kailh switches. Kailh is interesting because they have their own switches, which are an obvious direct copy of Cherry. However, they also have their own line of switches which are unique in the keyboard industry. The switches they produce are just copies of Cherry and perhaps a bit under par, so if you're looking for a basic red, blue, or brown switch, but you can't afford a Cherry switch, I suggest you look at Outemu or Gateron. However, that being said, if you're looking at something new or maybe just curious about the hype around Kailh switches, you should take a look at their box and speed switches. They are uniquely designed by Kailh and they're probably the reason that they're still in business. Their box switch overall just feels more stable than any other switch on the market, while their speed switch is very fast at registering keystrokes, and this may help you type faster or give you a competitive edge while gaming. However, if you're looking for something new, definitely give Kailh a shot. It's just don't invest too much in their direct copies of Cherry. You'll be disappointed. Now for the Outemu switches. They're the most budget-friendly switch, and that's pretty much their main selling point. While their Cherry MX clones are of higher quality than Kailh's Cherry clones, that's not saying much. The quality of Outemu switches are still subpar. There's a bit of a shaky feeling and perhaps a small rattle to them, and they're also not durable. They'll last quite a while, but not as long as other switches. Now, if you're new to mechanical keyboards and you're just looking to get started, the Outemu Switches would be a great start. They're cheap, affordable, and perform well for the price point. Their best switch is probably their clicky switch, so I suggest try that one out first. However, if you're more advanced in the mechanical keyboard world or if you have a slightly larger budget, then I would just avoid these switches. Now for the Razer switches. You probably heard of Razer, especially if you're a gamer. Their company is heavily in the gaming market and they create keyboards designed for this purpose. They also have their own key switches for the brand, and the reason why I put quotes around own is that they're not really their own switches. So Razer oftentimes will source their switches from Kailh and then just rebrand them as their own. And while I stated before that Kailh switches aren't that great, they're not, at least they're not cherry clone switches. Razer sources their switches from other companies as well, though they won't disclose that information. However, it's safe to say that it's probably equal to or less than the quality of Kailh. That said, Razer does have a slightly unique switch when it comes to their green switch, so if you're trying a Razer keyboard, I suggest finding one with a green switch, but still, it's not too impressive. The truth is that most gaming keyboard companies have a similar practice, and Logitech does the same thing. They're sourcing switches from other companies and rebranding them, so the result is a poorly performing keyboard that's often overpriced. And the reason that these keyboards even sell is through great marketing tactics. Most people don't do extensive research to realize that they're making a poor decision, and honestly, I would just avoid Razer altogether and look at some other switches I've talked about. However, if you still want to try a Razer switch, then the best choice would be the green switch. Now, how to choose a switch. Keep in mind when choosing a mechanical switch, it all comes down to personal preference. Each person appreciates certain characteristics more or less than someone else. So there are certain types of switches that may be geared towards a certain use. Linear switches are generally used in gaming. Tactile and clicky switches may be preferred if you're a typing enthusiast. Any type of switch can be used for any type of activity, so if you want a Cherry MX Blue, which is tactile and clicky for gaming, well, it's your right to do so, but I wouldn't do it personally, but you can if you want. Here are also a few things to consider. You want a durable switch, and you'll want to find a switch that you like the feel of based on the actuation point, the spring force, and travel distance. However, if you take a look at the things to consider when choosing a keyboard switch, you understand that how it all works, well, you'll be able to decide for yourself what interests you the most. As for the lifespan, it's important, but I don't think it's too drastic to worry about. Most switches are rated for about 50 million keystrokes, which is more than you'll probably ever reach. However, if you think that you'll wear out your key switches, then the Cherry MX switch will be your best bet as they're rated for over 100 million keystrokes. But I think something else will break before the switch does, making it a bit useless to be that durable. Unless, of course, you're familiar with the soldering and using the switches on another keyboard. So there are also some cheaply made switches that won't last even a million keystrokes, so it's better to be invested on a decent switch. However, it's easy to tell a cheap switch from a quality switch. Oftentimes, these switches will have what's called a key chatter, where a keystroke is registered multiple times, causing you to engage the backspace more times than you want. As for the actuation, there are two types of key switches to consider. You have the linear switch and the tactile switch, and it depends on personal preference. This will determine which switch to look for. So linear switches are preferred by gamers, but typists could also use them. The switch is exactly as it sounds, and each keystroke is one smooth action. There's no tactile feedback. The benefit of a linear switch is that it's much easier to repeatedly press keys. However, you can see this as beneficial in gaming, as oftentimes you need to perform certain combos very quickly. Tactile switches are preferred by typists, but gamers could use them, and the switch is also exactly as it sounds. The keystroke is smooth up to the point of actuation. Once you reach this point, there's no small bump that lets you know you've completed the keystroke. The benefit of a tactile switch is obvious. Typing makes it more clear when you press the key and it's time to go to the next one. Some people find that typing with linear switch results in more errors than a tactile switch. And then you also have the weight, which is the spring force. it gives an overall feel of your typing experience. There are heavy springs that require over 150 grams of force, and there are light springs which require about 50 grams of force. And you'll want a heavier spring if you're someone that types more forcefully. There's more resistance and it prevents you from bottoming out as much. In comparison, if you're a fairly light typist, you want to avoid a heavy spring. This is because the increased resistance will tire you out over time. So everyone is a bit different when using a keyboard, and it's important to match your spring force with your typing style. You'll be most comfortable when these two are at a perfect harmony. As for travel distance, it's another thing to look at when using a key switch. It refers to distance traveled between each keystroke. There's a standard travel distance, which we're pretty used to, and there's also the low profile and speed switches. If you're looking for a normal typing experience, then you won't care for the other types of switches, but it might be a bit weird to type overall. If you're looking for a slightly competitive edge with gaming, then it's something you might want to look into. So low profile switches and speed switches are more compact and lighter, plus their short travel distance, and it enables keystrokes to be registered a bit more quickly. In my opinion, these low profile switches are more of a pain than they're worth, so I won't recommend them. However, some people say they're better, so you just have to test them out for yourself. Now, in conclusion, now you should have a pretty solid understanding of these different types of switches. We've compared Cherry MX versus Gateron versus Kailh versus Outemu versus Razer Switches, and we saw how they're stacked up against each other. And with no surprise, Cherry MX switches are still one of the best. However, Gateron comes a very close second, with some of their switches outperforming Cherry's. However, Gateron takes the cake with the best budget switches, but if you want to save a bit more, go with Outemu, but you get what you pay for. As for the Razer and Kailh switches, I'd avoid them, but if you're new to mechanical keyboards, it could be a good start as it may save you some money, but it could also ruin the experience for you. All in all, it comes down to personal preference. I encourage you to go to some stores and try out these different parts for yourselves, and you'll learn what feels right for you, and you'll be able to pick a keyboard that gives you the best experiences possible. So that's it. Check out Keyboard Kings. For more guides and reviews, go to my website, keyboardkings.com. Thank you, and a link to this article will be in the description box below.